Hey, I'd like to spend a little bit of time with a few works of 18th century art that, as a way to try to illustrate how the styles of Rococo and Neoclassicism are both kind of similar and different, so you can get a sense of the general outline of those two. And also to take a little bit of time to look at another facet of 18th century art that the book only touches on. I'll look at that in a moment. That would be a kind of didactic art that is there specifically to communicate a message, and in the case that we'll be looking at, it'll be a satirical message. So we'll begin by looking at a couple of representative pieces of architecture, and then we'll dive into some paintings. So this is Heiligen Pilgrimage Church. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I'm certain I'm not. I just want to show this as an example of the Rococo style. In one of the aspects of Rococo is that it's a somewhat of an exaggeration of the Baroque style, and you can probably see that here. Comparing this to Il Gesù, which we looked at in the last module. Here, the curves are even more exaggerated. It looks like, honestly, it looks like a piece of confectionery. It looks like a cake. It's beautiful, but also at the same time somewhat precious. And those who don't like the style might even go so far as to call it sentimental or silly. Nevertheless, it is a tremendous achievement, and it shows the kind of almost frenzied nature of ornamentation that is typical of Rococo. In contrast, we have Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, his home in Charlottesville, Virginia, which he designed himself. He was a man of many talents. And you can see here, this is quite different, much more restrained, with references to both Roman and primarily Roman, but you can say Roman and Greek architecture, the geometric patterns, the columns on the portico, and then the domed roof that is a reference to Roman architecture. You can see how Jefferson, ever the rationalist, ever the typical Enlightenment thinker, believed in the importance of reason in understanding the world and in understanding human behavior, and his house is a very fine example of that kind of expression. And now we move on to painting. This is the tête-à-tête from a series that William Hogarth painted called Marriage à la Mode. Marriage in the style, or modern marriage, if you will, would be the proper translation of that. Tête-à-tête, of course, is a coming to blow, right? It's going head to head. Literally, tête-à-tête is head to head. The book tells you that the series of paintings is a description of, or a satirical observation of the kind of marriages that were becoming more and more common in upper class Europe during the 18th century. You have the daughter of an affluent bourgeoisie commoner who is quite wealthy for whatever reason, trade, industry, etc. And on the right, you have a nobleman who, at this time, the nobility are beginning to lose a lot of their wealth because there's started to be a shift from the agricultural basis of economics in European countries to more of a commercial or industrial basis, and that will only continue as we move into the 19th century. And so often we find situations where you have affluent commoners, bourgeoisie, who have all the wealth but none of the prestige of the nobility. And the nobility, on the other hand, who may be actually poorer than some of these bourgeoisie commoners. And so often what you have is a kind of arranged marriage where the father, the rich father who is a commoner, marries his daughter to a nobleman, so that way his daughter can take a title and his children will then be of the nobility. So you can see it. There's already a kind of strange social dynamic that is beginning to affect Europe as we're moving further and further away from the hierarchy of the Middle Ages to what we now understand and what we experience, which is a social status based upon wealth exclusively. So this marriage is not working out well in this particular scene here. What indicates that? Well, we have to sort of look at that iconography that I've talked about in the past in relation to religious painting. But now this is not a religious painting. This is a secular painting, and so we have to read the iconography. Clearly, we have with a woman stretching, with a man slouched in the chair with a kind of exhausted face, two characters who have been who stayed up very late into the night and doing whatnot. And we don't know what the whatnot is. The book suggests, if you look at the little dog down there, smelling what appears to be a handkerchief, that it's possible that this that the gentleman was out procuring himself some female companionship away from his wife. What the wife was up to, maybe the same thing. It's difficult to tell. What we do know is that this marriage is not a marriage of love. What we also see on the far left is one of the employees of these two, based upon the cash that he holds in his hand. He's probably probably oversees their finances, and the clearly distressed look on his face, as though he were looking up to God and pleading for help, suggests perhaps that these two are running through their money because, well, they're spending instead of loving. Again, a transformation of, let's put it this way. We can see the pressure in the marriage dynamics of the kind of larger social dynamics that are going on in Europe. And at the same time, in the back, there's a guy who looks like he's got a headache. I don't know what he's been up to, but the whole thing is somewhat fun. And yet, at the same time, Hogarth is making a very serious point about the emptiness of these kinds of marriages. And now let's turn to one of my absolutely favorite paintings to discuss. It is, I don't know that it's one of my favorite paintings, but I have spent so much time with this in past lectures discussing it that I can't resist talking about this painting. I don't know when you're looking at it right here what your initial response is. I find it to be just, for all of its prettiness, it is at its heart an incredibly vulgar and scandalous painting, and that is its intent. This is Fragonard is French. He is painting, of course, for the French aristocracy, and you can see the degree to which the taste of the French aristocracy go towards the scandalous and the superficial. So I'm going to be delving into the construction of this particular painting to show exactly how Fragonard makes this happen. And he's a brilliant artist, there is no doubt. But because he is employed for a kind of, you might argue, morally bankrupt class of of French nobility, the paintings themselves can't help but express a moral bankruptness, or at least a kind of a superficial approach towards what could otherwise be serious matters. By the way, if you were at all interested in looking into the a presentation of what the French aristocracy were like at this time, I highly recommend the novel Les Liaisons Dangereuses, which is what's called an epistolary novel. It's a novel written as a series of letters that was very common in the early days of the novel in the 18th century, which is the century in which the novel was born. There is also a very fine film version from the 1980s. You don't hear it talked about that much, with John Malkovich and oh God, I can't think of her name. Glenn Close, both nominated for Best Actor or actress, called Dangerous Liaison, and it's about how the French nobility, who are so wealthy and have nothing to do with their lives, spend their time in the case of these two figures, engaged in bets to ruin other people's lives. So I do highly recommend that film. It's a very good film, but it also is one of those few historical dramas that really does have something to say about the historical period in which it's set. All right, I've blocked out the section of the painting where there are people, just to show you the degree to which the background is prominent in this painting. The background takes up about a third of the work, and as you can see, in many respects, the detail that Fragonard lavishes on the background is one of the most impressive characteristics of this painting. The whole thing should remind you a little bit of the church that we saw earlier, whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce again. We see the same kind of energetic curves and the absence of the kinds of geometrical figures and lines that we expect from let's say neoclassicism. So the painting here suggests, and by the way, I'm going to make the argument, by making the figures occupy a smaller space in this canvas, we are meant to understand that the scene that we're viewing is a private scene. We're not supposed to be seeing it, which makes this painting even naughtier, because there's naughty things going on in the painting, but we're the naughty people too, because Fragonard puts us in a position as though we were voyeurs, as though we were peering through the bushes and looking at this. Now, once I take away the fill, we can see obviously what the human drama of this scene is, and you can see that it does really occupy an almost beautiful little oval here. So again, I just want to point out that though Fragonard as the quintessential Rococo artist, I would argue, um, is is concerned with curves, movement, ornamentation. He is still using those those rational techniques that we first saw being employed in paintings and sculptures of the Renaissance. So what do we have here? We have a woman in the center where eyes are being drawn there. Obviously, her color is quite distinct from everything else. Everything else is a sort of mix of browns, light greens, and grays, and a little bit of faint blue. But her pink dress, the pink and white of her clothing, it makes her stand out quite strikingly. I mean, it's really beautiful. I mean, I'm not as much as I'm, applying a kind of criticism to the values expressed in this painting. It doesn't mean that this painting is not, in fact, a very beautiful work of art. So, what's happening here? Again, we have a man pushing a woman in the swing, and there's another man at the bottom, the left, looking up at her. Now, if you, at this point, you probably have figured out pretty much what's going on, but I'm going to hammer the point. So, as we can see, here are our heads. The head of the man, sort of obscured. The head of the second man on the left, little less obscured. Of course, the head of the woman, cocked to the side, a kind of coquettish look upon her face. And as we can see, if we then combine or if we connect the heads with lines, we have a very, very nice, lovely triangle. And in fact, the triangle emphasizes what might be going on here. We don't know who this person to the right is. We don't know if the book suggests a chaperone. We don't know if this is a husband or a lover, but we also have another person who clearly does not have noble designs upon this woman. There are designs, but they're not noble. So we might very well have in this picture here a lover's triangle. There certainly is a triangle of people, some of whom, most specifically the one that's to the right and obscure, is oblivious to what's going on in the rest of the painting. Again, naughty, naughty, naughty. Now, if we look at the larger larger composition, it's very clear that we have a diagonal that's running from the upper left-hand corner down approximately to the lower right-hand corner, certainly to the gentleman, and it goes through, as you can see, it's a little bit obscure because of the line, it goes through the ropes that the man on the right is using to swing her. So we have the edge of the trees, and then we have her, and then we have the rope. So it's a very beautifully constructed, very clear, and yet subtle diagonal that takes our eyes from the upper left-hand corner down to the lower right-hand corner. In the future, bear in mind, I had an uncle who taught, who didn't teach, but he was a semi-professional photographer and art photographer. And one of the things I learned from him was that that our eyes in the West, mind you, not necessarily in Asia, but in the West, we tend to move our eyes from left to right and from up to down. Now, if you know the writings in Islam, in Chinese, Japanese, those are read from right to left. But we're not talking about that particular culture. Instead, bear in mind that we generally look from upper left to lower right. And the diagonals that artists construct are often there to emphasize that movement of the eye. And we have a very perfect example here. Notice, too, how beautifully everything to the upper right-hand side of that diagonal is in darkness. I mean, it is almost like clouds. It looks like a storm is brewing. But we have another diagonal, and this one extends from the shoulder of the man on the left, up through his arm, and then through the position of the young lady's body, up through her arm and the rope, one of the ropes that's tied to the limb of the tree from which she is swinging. So as you can see, we have a set of diagonals, and they meet at the approximate center of the canvas where we have the young lady's head. Very nice. But we have other diagonals as well, and those diagonals, obviously, are the ropes of the swing. And if you draw those diagonals, it leads you to a very intriguing place. The place where the young man is looking. And we see now that the earlier diagonal that I drew actually functions as a third part of this this intersection of lines. And again, I would have you note exactly where that intersection is. It is exactly where the man on the left is looking, and it is, and we now know what he's doing. He's looking up her skirt. Now, whether there is something to see up her skirt, in the sense that it's unclothed, meaning without underwear, we don't know. But I think our minds are led to, allowed to go in that direction so that we can make this painting, as I'm sure many French nobility who looked at it did. Ooh, how naughty. And one final diagonal, and that would be the diagonal of the young lady's dress, which extends from that intersection point, goes up through her foot to her shoe, and then over the top of the statue. And notice I have here a ray, in other words, a line with a tip with a arrow at the end, what geometrically you would call a ray. There's a ray because that's, of course, the thrust of the movement of the swing as well. But in addition to the thrust of the swing, it draws our attention back up to the shoe. The discarding of the shoe in a very careless way is a piece of iconography that suggests undressing, which then further emphasizes the relationship between the man on the left and the woman in the center, that there is an erotic sexual relationship between those two, and that there's very likely a plan that she did go without underwear, and he knew to be placed in that position so that he could have the excitement of looking up her dress and seeing her naughty bits. As you can see, brilliant painting, impeccably constructed using all of the traditional compositional elements. I can't go on enough about how wonderfully made this painting is, and yet what's at the heart of it, sexual lasciviousness. That's what this painting is about. And now we have a very different type of painting. This is Jacques-Louis David's Napoleon Crossing the Alps, another one that I very much enjoy talking about. I want to point out, first off, that this is not technically a painting from the 18th century. David worked in the 18th and into the 19th century, and his artwork is indicative of both neoclassical and romantic periods. And that's one reason why I chose this particular artwork to talk about, because it does allow me to prepare you to make the transition from the neoclassical period and the 18th century into the Romantic period of the 19th century. I'm using the same techniques that I applied to the Fragonard to talk about this David. And so, as you can see, I've blotted out the entire area of this painting that involves actors, human, in this case, of course, equine. And as you can see, there's not much left of this painting. As I go forward, I want you to notice the differences in the background. Here, the background is not especially precise. It is not ornamental. It is merely functionary. Compare that to, as a reminder, the Fragonard. And again, the Fragonard, and as you can see, there is almost as much background as there is action. And the background is presented in luxurious detail, unlike the David. And here we have the painting again, the David, without the blotted out section, instead just the oval, to indicate, again, a very similar kind of compositional structure. Notice there is a balance to this. The oval is slightly off-center, but only slightly off-center, and the focal point here is the individual, and the individual, of course, is Napoleon. There is something that David is trying to communicate to us about that individual, and it is not superficial, it is not frou-frou-y, it is not sexy. It's something of power. Like in the Fragonard, we have diagonals that cut through the landscaping and the hooves of the horse at the bottom. The bottom of the horse going from the whatever you would call that. It's not a knee, but the right joint of the horse's the joint of the horse's right rear leg through the underside of the horse and then out towards the off the picture. The same thing with the top of the horse. We can see that, and the top of the horse, by the way, also that diagonal goes up through the mountains, the Alps there, the peaks, and then a final diagonal that takes us through Napoleon's hand pointing forward, plus his flowing cape. And of course, as you can see, there's a lot of motion. It's arrested motion, but it's motion. We've got elements that indicate that there is a wind blowing. So the horse's mane is flowing forward, so is the horse's tail, so is Napoleon's cape. So there is this thrust. That's why I have the rays there instead of just the lines, because the entire painting, especially the centerpiece here, is conveying an outward and upward thrust, which of course makes sense because this is Napoleon ascending the Alps. So we have composition that conveys this movement. But I want you to notice that the diagonals going from the upper, depending on how you look at it, upper left to lower right, as I spoke about with Fragonard, I'm indicating that they're actually directing us upwards, but the diagonals in terms of lines function the same way. So from lower right to upper left, or upper left to lower right, those are our dominant diagonals, and yet look what David has done. The classicist that he is, he's constructed a sort of diagonal that cuts from the upper right-hand corner of the painting to the lower right-hand corner of the painting, and it takes us through the body of Napoleon. So while we have this force that's driving us forward, we also have a counterbalancing weight that keeps everything balanced. This is not a painting where we're being thrust forward. We're caught in the action, but the action is perfectly balanced and composed. So what we have in the end is a very fine neoclassical composition with attention to absolute precision, not just in terms of the diagonal compositions of the painting, not just in terms of putting the primary subject matter at the center and at the fore, but also in terms of the way it's balanced. However, I call this also an example of romanticism because of the person that is being presented and of the way he's being presented. As we will see in the next module, romanticism involves a kind of emphasis on the heroic, the ability of a person to create himself. And Napoleon was a very popular figure among romantics, even those who weren't French, because he was literally a self-made man. He went from being a lowly officer to an emperor that conquered most of Europe. Also, too, you see the elements of nature in the background. Now, I said that there wasn't a lot happening in the background, but what we see in the background is a kind of nature as a force that is also going to be an important element in Romanticism. And Napoleon at once seems to be emanating from nature. He seems to be emerging out of the mountains, and yet at the same time, as this heroic individual, he also has harnessed nature in the form of the horse. The horse looks like it's on the verge of bucking him or running away, and yet notice how Napoleon is balanced, calm, and confident, and he's looking right at you. The idea here for David's audience is that Napoleon is leading you. If you were a Frenchman or a French woman looking at this painting, you would be seeing the leader of your country. Also the element of nationalism comes out of Romanticism, and we'll see that playing out as well in Module 5. So I hope this has been somewhat enlightening. I've had some fun doing it, enjoy.